Let me just, before we begin, introduce our guest who needs little introduction. Nevertheless, Ruth Wisse is professor of Yiddish literature and comparative literature at Harvard University, former director of its Center for Jewish Studies. She's written really too many books to name, but tonight we're here to celebrate and really reinvestigate this book from 2007, Jews and Power. So join me in welcoming Ruth Wisse.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming, and especially people whom I know. It's very heartening to see you here. So thank you so much for having me. And it's a book which I wrote several years ago, so I hope I still remember the arguments that I made in it, but we'll see.
In this room, there'll be people to help you.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right.
So look, I thought we could just begin. If you don't mind, I'm going to quote you to yourself.
All right.
This is a passage that you write early in the book, but I think really lays out, in a way, the theological core from which many political arguments flow. The prophets, you write, taught that the political fate of the Jews depend on their ability to convince not their rivals of their military prowess, but God of their uprightness. They linked a nation's potency to its moral strength, putting the Jews on a perpetual trial for their political actions and before a supreme judge. So I wonder, what is the political implication from that kind of theological stance in the Bible?
Well, that is kind of the starting point of the book. And the problem in it is that the good and the bad are really inextricably bound up. I think that the fact that Jews invested their entire being in this contractual agreement with God, including God's oversight or God's being the guarantor of their power, meant that the Jews would be indestructible. Because other nations go to war with one another. You defeat me, I'm defeated. I defeat you, you're defeated. It's as simple as that, or as complicated as that. And then if you survive enough, we can go to war again. But basically, it is a contest of power between the two of us. What happened in the Jewish self-conception is that when the Jews were defeated by Babylon, and largely because of the prophetic interpretation of this whole process, what they said was that we are being defeated because we were not good enough in God's eyes. It isn't really the Babylonians who defeated us. It isn't really the Romans who defeat us. It isn't really X who defeats us. It's because we did not live up to the contractual agreement that we made with God. Now, what this means is that Jews could put a tremendous amount of pressure on themselves to live up to the expectations of the contractual agreement that they had with God. So they become very self-accountable, very self-reliant, very self-critical, and always trying to perfect themselves in order to be worthy of God's investment in them. And that makes them really, through the length of history, undefeated, because every time they are defeated, they say, well, the only thing that we have to do now is to persuade God that we are worthy of him and we will be restored to our homeland, right? God will come to, he will reinvest his confidence in us. But what happens also cumulatively on the other side is that Jews are always defeated because they do not invest the same degree of power in their ability to defeat their enemies. And what happens through history, through this long process of Jews remaining a minority with this self-conception, is that Jews are always attractive to attack and to defeat and to expel and to expropriate. Why? Because this civilization of self-accountability has made them really excellent in many ways. In other words, it's a very good civilization. It works. It works. And if everybody were like the Jews, it would be a wonderful world. But the problem is that other people don't see it that way, and they really do believe in conquest. And when they see this people that really just feels that it has to conquer itself and prove itself, and they see that this people has really acquired all these things, why not? Why not just take it over? And so Jews become what I call a no-fail target. It becomes almost always possible after a period of time to defeat them, in fact, and there is never a political cost to be paid, because the political cost would have to be paid by God. And even when God sometimes punishes those enemies, the Jews do not afterwards come out and say, yeah, you see, that was a punishment from our God for what you did. In other words, if they even used it as a lever in that way, it might have become a political instrument. But it was not really, on the whole, the Jewish way of dealing with it. And so this is the perplexing and really, I would say, extraordinary bind, if you will, the extraordinary paradox of Jewish existence, that the better Jews are, the more politically vulnerable they become.
Tell me if this is an accurate restatement, but one can interpret that by saying that the moral probity, which is cultivated, encouraged by traditional Jewish morality, when it bleeds into its excess, can become a form of solipsism. I think the term that you use in the book is moral solipsism.
Yes. Well,
the two things are bound up in that way.
They are, because it is a wonderful thing to hold yourself accountable. But what happens in the modern period, this is skipping maybe too rapidly, but we can see that moral solipsism really manifest in our own times, when you really begin to take the responsibility for what goes wrong with other people as well. You think that the only thing that matters is your moral probity. All that matters is your moral uprightness. Are we good enough? Have we done this well enough? And so the whole concentration is on yourself, and it becomes a kind of moral solipsism, really. You just focus on your own morality, when more and more, in fact, when you're interacting with people around you, one of the things that should concern you is that the moral level of people around you should be rising to yours. I think that this is also a function of morality, that if I'm really a concerned citizen, and if I'm really a citizen of the world, I should not be concentrated exclusively on my self-perfection. I should have some concern for the relative perfectibility of other people around me.
Well, I do want to dive back into history for a couple more minutes, because in many ways the feel of the book has elements of a historical retelling, and the political analysis is embedded in these historical moments. But one of the most arresting, I thought, was a pairing, which is not often made, but in your case it is. The Jewish Roman historian Josephus and the Talmudic story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa both articulate an analysis of the fall of the Second Temple. About the Talmudic discussion in particular, you write that it contains an entire political treatise. So I wonder, what unites those two tellings, and who are those people, how are they different, and what unites them?
Well, to answer that, I think would be beyond my capacities right here. But the fact is that both of these are united, in my mind at least, in this particular way. Josephus blames basically the Jewish rebels for the defeat of the Jews by Rome. He does not think retroactively, he thinks that this was a mistake. And as a result of that, he becomes one of the most creative, effective traitors in history. and also the historian whose account we have of what happened at that time. It's really quite remarkable that a people should know its own history through the person who betrayed it, in a sense. But that is the case. But it is, you see, what Josephus was concerned about was how were the Jews responsible? What did they do? What is it that they did that was responsible for what happened to them? Now, the story in the Talmud of Kamsa bar Kamsa has always, as somebody here has already joked about it, has always troubled me profoundly. Because what does it say? It tells a very complex, you can look it up, because an invitation went astray, and man was insulted, and as a result of that insult, he actually did betray Jews to the Romans and so forth. And so out of this comes this exquisite concept of sinat chinam, our internal rivalry. And one of the things that the rabbis claimed was that Jews were defeated by Rome because of their internal rivalry. And every time things go really wrong in Israel today, you see people say, oh, you see, it's sinat chinam. It's because we're always internally arguing among ourselves. That's why they defeated us. My answer to that would be, really? What about the American Civil War? Now, the American Civil War is the bloodiest war that America ever fought. It was a horrific civil war, pitted against one another. And guess what? There are people who say that America came out stronger because of this civil war. So how come? If that's sinat chinam, why can a civil war strengthen a country? Well, the answer is really quite elementary. Americans could fight their civil war and come out of it intact because Canada, Mexico, the other countries that surrounded it did not use that opportunity to attack it and to defeat it and to destroy it. Whereas the problem with the internal rivalry at the time of the Jews under Roman rule was that Rome did use whatever it could in order to breach the walls and in order to destroy this people. So again, yes, the idea, we don't want internal rivalry that reaches terrible proportions, although we must say that the democratic system depends on eternal rivalry. There have to be differences between those who are more liberal tending, more conservative tending, whatever the split is. That's healthy within a society. When it becomes problematic is when, I think, when there are enemies. And so one of my suggestions is that Jews who take these things seriously should have a sign in their homes and in their institutions. 3 words: it was Rome. It was not sinat chinam. Ultimately, it was Rome. That focuses the mind on what's really at stake.
And so what, I mean, just as a follow-up, what is the role of looking internally, and to what extent have Jews been morally culpable in Jewish failures, and how does one balance that against what are actual threats, external threats?
Well, that's a very good question. I am certainly not advocating that Jews cease to be moral, but I think that you'll find that Jews have, in terms of relative morality with other people, I think that the Jewish record is pretty strong. And one of the things that one finds in the study of Yiddish literature, for example, and it's one of the things that forces people sometimes ask, how did somebody who is supposed to be a professor of Yiddish literature, how did you get involved in politics? And the answer is really quite straightforward, that if you really take seriously the trajectory of Yiddish literature and the whole world of Yiddish literature, it really is in part the history of Jewish mistakes. How could a community so morally refined? The Jewish community of Eastern Europe was really morally refined. It's not that there weren't crooks. There were pickpockets, there were crooks, there were all kinds of crime. But overrepresentation of certain kinds of criminality, strong underrepresentation of violence, violent acts. And on the whole, I would say, really, as I say, a self-disciplining, a self-accountable communities with a very strong sense of mutual aid and universal literacy and so forth, very high degree of morality, totally, totally annihilated. So that, again, I think that this really makes one have to concentrate on the too great a gap between what the Jews are able to achieve in terms of their own self-perfection and what is done to them. And it is almost as if these two things are complementary to one another, that there is a connection between these two. And the connection lies in the political aspects of what the Jews consider their moral action.
One of the potential solutions to Jewish oppression in the diaspora was thought to be, and this the most hoped for really, was thought to be European political enlightenment. The spread of the franchise to the Jews, the invitation that Jews become full citizens in the nations of Europe. What effect did the liberal political developments have on the Jewish relation to power?
So I devote one of the chapters of the book to this particular problem, which is, again, a very painful part of it. Everyone assumed, I mean, perhaps not everyone, but a great many enlightening and enlightened Jews and others assumed that, of course, the process of liberalization, of democratization, was going to improve the situation of citizens and was therefore going to improve the rights of man. It was going to improve people's relation to one another. It was going to better the world. And so the 19th century has sometimes been called the century of progress. Everybody believed in progress, partly because of this process of political democratization. One certainly would not wish it otherwise. But a strange thing happened. As rulers were defeated and pulled down in favor of democracies, and as rulers themselves had to begin to win the support of their people, what you began to have is the democratic process. In other words, you had to appeal to people. You had to appeal to all the people. And they had to be the ones to vote. They had to be the ones to elect. And really, power was in the hands, more and more in the hands of the people. What happens? You have a politician, and this is in fact what happened. You have politicians who are seeking to gain the confidence of the electorate. How are they going to gain it? Well, one of the ways is through explanation. If I can tell you why you're miserable, if I can tell you why you're poor, if I can tell you why you're not as well off as your neighbor, then you may have confidence in me. Well, one of the great explanations was the Jews. The Jews were a very visible minority. As you know, if you know European history, wherever they were allowed to compete on equal terms, they competed very effectively. So they acquired goods, they acquired visible residences, they acquired even sources of power. They became culturally important in various places. How easy it then became to say, you know why you're poor? It's because of the Rothschilds. They have your money. You know why the church is declining. It's because of Jewish influence. The Jews run the newspapers, the Jews run the arts, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. Now, the explanation is in a sense preposterous because, of course, what was going wrong and what was and what had to be changed, what had to be improved, had nothing essentially to do with the Jews at all. But here you have, in a word, in an image, something to which you can point your finger. And as some of you may be aware, this question was recently asked, is this applicable to, it's Tom Perkins, I believe, a CEO in San Francisco, who wrote in the Wall Street Journal that he made the comparison between this and pointing the finger at the 1%. The 1%. And he said this reminded him of the same technique of fingering the Jews. And somebody from the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League and others said, oh, you mustn't use that analogy. You must not use that analogy of this. Well, I think it is a perfect analogy because it is the same political construct of politics of grievance and blame. You blame, you point the finger, you say that is responsible. So first of all, it's an explanation, and an explanation is comforting. And also, it organizes grievance and blame. People who, again, if I'm looking for votes, I want to give you some satisfaction. And if you can have a grievance against someone, and if you can blame someone, and if that kind of, you can persuade people that there is something to that, it really helps you win governance. Now, there's something terribly wrong with that. Terribly wrong with it, because for one thing, the people being blamed, the Jews, were not accountable. You could destroy the Jews of Europe, which one did, and it did not solve the problems for which they were being blamed. So one sees that this politics of grievance and blame, effective as it may be in gaining power, is certainly not effective in long-term governance. But the other part of it is that it really ruins the society that it gains control of, because the problems become more and more entrenched. In other words, you're just postponing actually dealing with the problems. And so the very problems that you say that you're going to be solving through this politics of grievance and blame become more and more entrenched, and they become worse. This is one of the real problems of anti-Semitism. And this is also I tried to address in the book. When people think of anti-Semitism, they think of the Jews. In effect, anti-Semitism has nothing to do with the Jews. It uses the Jews, and it uses the Jews because they are a small polity with a largely inflated image. There are many reasons we could go into for why the Jews are such a convenient target, but it has nothing to do with the Jews. So when one talks about anti-Semitism, one has to understand that it has to do with the anti-Semites. It has to do with those who are controlling the issue. And those people are really undermining the societies that they are governing.
The analysis in the book was mostly focused on the elaboration of liberalism in Europe. And the response to offering liberal rights to Jews in Europe was anti-Semitism. How does the dynamic change, or does it change in the United States? And what is the role of the Jews in power in the United States, which has a very different political history and a very different type of set of political ideas? But is liberalism damned by anti-Semitism in both places?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think that if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, at least as it seems to me, it's as follows. If you have a really thick democracy, in other words, if you have a polity which is self-accountable to the same degree that Jews consider themselves self-accountable, if we have a polity here in the United States where it's divided, let's say, between Republicans and Democrats, and they both know that between them they have to solve whatever has to be solved. And so you have an enormous amount of negative campaigning, tremendous amount of negative campaigning. The idea is at the end of the day, though, the Republicans can blame the Democrats can blame the Republicans, but between the two of them, they know that they are going to have to solve the problems. The problem has become, and would become, if one does not say that, but they say, you know what, the 1% is responsible. Now, until now, I think that America has avoided anti-Semitism of the kind that I define as anti-Semitism because it has not needed it. In other words, it has known that it is a textured democracy, a genuine democracy, I would say a thickly rooted democracy. And as long as it is that, and people know that they have to come together to solve their problems, they're not going to look for cheap and easy answers. They're going to go back to the drawing board, and they're going to have to know that they're going to solve these problems among themselves. The problem arises every once in a while when people want an easy answer, an easy explanation, and an easy target to hold up there and say, you see, that's who's really responsible for what goes wrong. Let me just say that I try to make a distinction between prejudice, on the one hand, prejudice, bias, things of that kind, and anti-Semitism. Prejudice is awful. There has been discrimination in this country. We all know that there were institutions that had quotas against Jews in the 1930s and maybe beyond. I attended such an institution in Canada that was just getting over its quota system against Jews. All these things are terrible. Let's face it. In this country, anti-black, anti-foreign racism was much stronger against other groups than it was against the Jews. It's horrible. Discrimination is terrible. Prejudice is terrible. Bias is terrible. It is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a political ideology that began in Europe in the 1870s, and I would define it narrowly so that we know what we're talking about, as the organization of politics against the Jews, which is very different from prejudice. You can be prejudiced against people whom you believe to be inferior to you. This was not anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism said, the Jews are conquering Germany. It didn't say Jews are worse than us. It said Jews are dangerous because they're responsible for everything that's going wrong. That's the organization of politics against the Jews. And you see the difference here. It's a tremendous difference because this is a political instrument, a political strategy, a political ideology that goes way beyond. Of course, it harnesses prejudices, it harnesses discrimination, but it is of a different magnitude.
Well, one of the strategies that Jewish thinkers developed for confronting this birth of anti-Semitism was a tremendous renaissance of energy and attention into refounding a Jewish state in the Jewish homeland. Now, you devote an important chapter in your book to Zionism, and I was hoping that you could just share with us the degree to which Zionism solves or addresses the fundamental problems of Jews in power.
Well, it was a wonderful solution of a kind, and I don't think that people like Herzl or Lillian Bloom or all the Zionist thinkers, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, I don't think that they could have solved it better for their time. And they thought very logically that the reason that the Jews were so susceptible to attack of all kinds, in the Dreyfus case and in pogroms in Russia, was because they were dispersed, because they had no political power and they had no powers of self-defense, because they were not sovereign. And they felt that if Jews reconstituted themselves as a sovereign people, the same way as so many other nations were becoming politically liberated, that would help to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. In fact, they thought it would solve the problem of anti-Semitism. Now I don't have to, I hope, in this assembly or any other, I wish one didn't have to talk about the astonishing accomplishments of Zionism. I don't think that there is a movement of self-liberation in the modern world that comes close to Zionism in its achievement, in its marvels. And consider just this, that the state of Israel came into being in the same decade that a third of the Jewish people was annihilated. That is really just an astonishing fact, and it seems to me that it ranks with miracles, with biblical miracles on a biblical level. So Zionism had fantastic accomplishments of all kinds. But one of the things that it could not foresee, and that it couldn't foresee because of what Zionists were, they couldn't understand that this could happen for the best of reasons, right? But it did happen. They couldn't understand that a Jewish people that reconstituted itself in a tiny sliver of land could serve exactly the same purpose in the anti-Semitic ideologies of other nations as the dispersed Jews had served in Europe. Yeah. So what you have in 1945, before the State of Israel comes into being, is that the Arab states, the Arab League, organizes around one main principle, believe it or not. And that is the organization of politics against the Jews of Israel, right? And so now Israel begins to serve exactly the same role in the politics of other nations as the Jews served in the politics of European nations. And even beyond, if one looks at anti-Semitism as an instrument, and you ask the question, what role does it serve? What role does it serve? What's its function? That's always the question. What role is the organization of politics against the Jews serving? If you ask that question, you see that the functions it serves in the Arab world are much greater, unfortunately, much more necessary to them as they have constructed it than it ever was for the nations of Europe. And for one reason, among others, after all, the nations of Europe were in the process of liberalization, in part. There were liberals in Germany. There were liberals in Poland. There was a liberalizing tendency in France and in other countries. But in the Arab world, the whole process of liberalization, of self-accountability, that whole process has not even begun or scarcely begun. So you can see how this need for blaming, for grievance and blame and locating blame in someone else plays a much, much more important role.
Well, I want to ask you about different reactions to that in turn. Based on your experience in teaching and your experience with young people, do Israelis and American Jews relate to power differently, facing different threats?
Wow. Do they? Of course, physically they do. The real difference that everybody perceives is that you cannot pogromize the Jews any longer at will. The Israel Defense Forces has become a very effective defense force. It's called the Israel Defense Forces, and the Israel Defense Force defends. I was very struck the other day when the Jewish community of Ukraine actually sent out a call to Israel to ask whether Israelis would come to defend them. This is really astonishing, right? That you now feel that there is this defense force that one has always hoped for that could come to the defense of Jews everywhere. That has been a tremendous difference. But what difference has it made in the political structure of the Jewish people vis-a-vis others? As you see, I don't think what Jews seem to have won is the right of self-defense. But I don't think that Jewish politics in Israel has changed sufficiently. no more than politics among us, among Jews in America or Jews elsewhere. Let me try to explain what I mean by this. If one looks at it now retroactively, in 1948, the day after the State of Israel was declared, and the Arab states attacked Israel, and Israel won its war of independence, what does it mean that the Arab states refused to recognize Israel? What does that mean? How dare they have refused? I mean, when America won its war of independence against England, England said it had won the war and America had its independence. What gave the Arab countries the right to refuse to recognize a sovereign state? It is in the charters. I ask you, go home, take a look, and you can get it on, but just with one tap of the finger, you can see what the Charter of the United Nations proclaims. Right in the beginning, in the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations, the reason it was founded was in order to give respect, mutual respect, to every nation, large and small. When the Arabs refused to accept the sovereignty of the State of Israel, they should have been expelled from the United Nations. That is what the United Nations stood for, right? How can we now find ourselves 60 some odd years, almost 70 years later, when the Palestinians are still deliberating and the Saudis are still deliberating as to whether they are going to accept the Jewishness of the Jewish state? I mean, this is an outrage. Now, the fact that we do not understand, that the world doesn't understand that this is an outrage, is because Israel has not been saying every day of every week of every year, you owe us unconditional acceptance of who we are as a state. We are not paying anything for that acceptance. That is what we are owed a priori. You are at fault in this. How can one find oneself in this position so many years later? Well, one of the answers is, we seem to have this notion that, we are accommodators and we are adapters, and sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me, and who cares what they think and who cares what they say, and so they don't recognize me. I'll do without it. I mean, it's very debonair, but that is not learned political realism, I think. I think that one has to ask for justice. One has to ask on one's own behalf before you can ask other people to join you in asking for what is your due. You have to first have that sense that this is your right and that this is owing to you and that you demand it, right?
What can one say to that? Let me ask you about the Americans. You have for a number of years been at the place where future generations of American leadership are educated. So, just as a simple empirical question, what is the state of the Jews and the state of Israel at Harvard?
That puts me on the spot. Well, pretty much the same as it is. There are no surprises. We'll start with the good news that you have had for the past 10, 15 years. There is a very strong, small, but active and increasingly active group of students called Students for a Safe Israel. And those students are there to fight for a safe Israel. So they are there on campus, and you find extremely fine and vigorous and, wonderful people involved in this. You have the field of Middle East studies is horrific The field of Middle East studies has been basically hijacked by and run by people who are, who sometimes these are people venally against Israel. They have really adopted this idea that Israel is responsible for everything that goes wrong in the Arab world. But most of the people, my colleagues, are not venal in that way. It's just that you have to put yourself into the position of people who spend their whole lives doing research in Arabic in those countries, who need access to their scholars, who need access to their monies, to their research and so on. So slowly, you almost can't help yourself. The same thing happened, by the way, in the Cold War. In Harvard during the Cold War, you only had one Richard Pipes, really, who really was fighting on the American side in the Cold War. Most of the people in Russian studies at that time, and Slavic studies, were really very, very generously interpretive of, you know, the Soviet side, because that's where they did their work, and that's, to some extent, the coloration that they take on. So those are the two extremes, if you will. Disturbing things happen. Let me cite one of the most disturbing, not one of the most dangerous, but one of the most disturbing. And that is the Israelis who come to Harvard, and they take over Hillel House, and they put up a display. What is it called? They put up a display of, excuse me? Thank you. Breaking the silence. They are going to break the silence. What is the silence? The silence is supposedly that Israel does wrong against the Palestinians. Now, of course, this is in fact a total inversion. Everything that you hear is that Israel does wrong to the Palestinians. Breaking the silence is these 6 or 7 or 15 kids maximally in Jews for a Safe Israel who do break the silence. And they say that no, that is not the case. So breaking the silence, these are kind of what in Israel would be called yefei nefesh, beautiful souls. In Israel, in Yiddish you say zise neshama lach, sweet little souls. Now, you may think that nothing can sound nicer. Zise neshama lach, it sounds so sweet. It's not used that way in Yiddish. When you say zise neshama lach, it's usually used very pejoratively. A person who wraps himself in their own, you know, moral goodness. So I found this really to be one of the most disturbing things in the world. Can you imagine people advertising their own superior goodness against the defenders of the state of Israel, the fellow soldiers whom they fight with, outing them, coming to Harvard, coming to the world to show people what they have done wrong in a state which, by the way, imprisons Israeli soldiers for doing anything wrong, right? I found this really to be one of the most disturbing things. And then, of course, you confront Hillel with the problem. Should we show this or should we not show this? The Big Ten, should we take this in? It hurts the students who see it so much. It hurts every Jewish student to see this. We all understand that this is not morality. Any person, I would say, with a real moral bone in their body would understand that this is anti-morality, that this is what I call pretty boy morality, or the moral strut. You know, people who want to advertise their morality at the expense of the people, you know, who are their brothers and sisters, and the people fighting for their survival, So these are kinds of disturbing things. And it's one of the things that makes it hard to be a Jew. You know, to keep your equilibrium in this is not a simple task. I find it hard after all these years of being and thinking and so forth. And if I find it hard, you can imagine a student, a freshman, a sophomore, even a senior, you know, in this situation what are they to do about it? A student came to see me the other day, a wonderfully fine, may I say that I only see wonderfully fine students there, really, with great moral intensity and intelligence. And I was surprised. She said to me, we are so passive as a group, as a student. I said, passive? In what sense are you passive? She said, well, you know, people used to protest. People used to protest, and we do not protest. Now, this is a conservative student. So I said, well, yes, in a sense, aren't you protesting by standing up every day for what you believe in and not going along with everything that is pulling you in all these directions that you feel that you have to resist? Isn't resistance a form of protest? But you can see how difficult it is to be the naysayer, to be the one to say, no, don't take that in, because it does not belong in the Jewish family. See how difficult that is.
Well, many of the students, no doubt, will have been nourished before they arrive at Harvard by symbols of Jewish history and Jewish memory in the United States as a whole. And one of the things that I know you have a very defined point of view about is the United States Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C. And I wonder if we could just end our part of the conversation here, if you could just elaborate your interpretation of what it is, what it stands for, how it crystallizes a certain view of Judaism and power.
Yeah. Well, this is a painful subject as well. One perfectly understands the impulses that went into the building of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and every Holocaust memorial. I have such respect for Elie Wiesel, and I've known, I grew up among people who survived the Holocaust. There's practically the only people I knew, my teachers and others and so forth, so I know what they were feeling. But these memorials are probably, from a political point of view, which is, what I stress, probably the worst kind of thing that one could possibly have done. And certainly the way in which the Holocaust Museum in Washington is laid out is probably the biggest mistake of all. And it can be changed. And the reason that I would come to this subject is because I think it could be altered, it could be transformed. Why do I think it is wrong? Well, for one thing, I don't know if you've been in the Washington Mall. It's glorious. The Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian Museum. It's the grandeur of everybody wants to show off the grandeur of the place. Come the Jews. They win a place on the Mall, and what do they show the United States of America? Kids from Nebraska, kids from all over, never seen a Jew before, don't know anything about Judaism. But they come to see the Holocaust, the way in which the Jews were butchered and destroyed. And this is something with which they're going to identify. Now, for one thing, I think I understand why Jimmy Carter, who was not a great friend of the Jews, was the one under whose administration the Holocaust Museum was built, because it reinforces a Christian view of the world. That if I see the crucifixion, this is going to be redemptive. And if you see the Jews crucified, this is going to be a redemptive experience. That's the premise, no? Why else would you expose people to it? Expect that you think you're going to go through this process to see people annihilated, and you're going to come out thinking, oh, I'm a much better person as a result of that, because I'm never going to annihilate anyone. This is really the message. So why do I think that this is? How could it be transformed? It could be transformed in one of two ways, and it could have been built differently in one of two ways. One, it could be told as the Passover story. We tell the Passover story every year, and how does it begin? We were slaves in the land of Egypt. Nobody denies that. Nobody lies about it. To the contrary, you spend a great deal of time immersed in how awful it was, how degrading it was, how miserable. You have to retaste it. You have to re-experience it. But that is the first part of the story. And then you tell the story of how the people is transformed, how God really does take the Jews out of Egypt, right? This is the story. And then you celebrate the fact that you have gained your freedom, won it in a very, very hard way. Now, that would have been a story to tell at the Holocaust Museum, to tell the first part of the story and then to show that in that same decade, the Jews of Israel created the state, a model state, integrated all these people who had survived, brought in the 800,000 people fleeing Arab lands, built a society of strength and tolerance and democratic values and all the rest of it, and show America that this is a model for you, right? This is a redemptive model for you. So that's one possibility, and I think the better one. But there would have been another one, and that is to say, this is a museum of anti-Semitism. And then it would have to do the hard job of right in the center, what would be the central exhibit? Well, it would be Hussein, it would be Husseini meeting with Hitler to force him, to persuade him to destroy the rest of the Jews of Europe. That's the connection, yes. Well, and that is the fact. The strange thing about the Holocaust Museum, I don't know whether you ever noticed this, that in the bookstore of the Holocaust Museum for the longest time, they would not allow books that made that connection. They would not allow books about Arab anti-Semitism because, now this is the really thing, because they did not want it to be politicized. You take the greatest political, the most horrific political event of the 20th century, you raise a museum to it, and you say you don't want it to be politicized. So I would say that part of this is because we have not reconstructed ourselves fully politically, on a political level. We've changed the way in which we function we've regained our sovereignty. We've made so many steps forward, but we still think in old ways. And we don't understand that our story, our being is very different. We have something very strong and positive and remarkable to share with people. And we do them as well as ourselves an injustice when we don't.
Professor Wisse has agreed to take a couple questions.
Sir. What do you think about the whole spate of anti-Israel books that's come out in the last few years, mostly written by Jews?
Essentially delegitimizing Israel.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot about it. I don't think much of it, but I think a lot about it. And I would say that it is, unfortunately, an almost inevitable consequence of the war against the Jews. I think one would have to say that the longer the aggression against the Jews continues, the more ferocious it is, the more Jews are going to get on the bandwagon as well. That has always been part of the Jewish story. Now, that's not that one has to accept it. And I think that the interesting thing is that you're right that there are more of them coming on the market, and there are people to sell to, including people who put out things like the New Yorker, who are also Jews, right? But it's not just an internal story. There are a lot of pressures on people in order to join that narrative. But there are also a lot of people fighting back these days. And look, number one on the bestseller list of nonfiction for a long time is Charles Krauthammer, who is one of the strongest defenders of Israel and everything that Israel represents. The Wall Street Journal is still to this day the most powerful newspaper in the United States of America and strongest in many ways. It is really a newspaper that supports the state of Israel and makes the case for it. You now have in this building, we did not have before, something like Tikva. We didn't have Mosaic. We didn't have, certain kinds of instruments that were on the web that really did this work day in and day out, really explaining for those who need explanation at a high level, everything that has to be resisted and so forth. So I would say that yes, those things are increasing, but maybe the others are also becoming feistier, and let's hope so.
Ma'am in the back here.
Thanks so much for coming. My question is focused on the recent spate of mass demonstrations of the Haredim in Israel and even in Manhattan against the draft. I recently read of someone quoted, "Oh, we don't know how to shoot a gun. We're peaceful. So you talk about Jews in power. How did it come that the Haredim are so against any form of fighting for the Jewish people?"
Well, it's a real question, and we know how it happened. We know that Ben-Gurion carved out an exception for them. We know some of the reasons that he did it. He did it because he was a political pragmatist, and he needed the support of certain elements, and he made that compromise at a time when he thought, that it involved only a certain number of people, without thinking that when you really found a state of this kind, you cannot compromise with an essential kind of element within it. But this is being rolled back now, and those protests that you're referring to are protests because the law is being changed. And it's being changed because I think that there is a sense of the unfairness of it all. That's one thing. The other thing is that he may have even had some sympathies, and lingering in the back of our minds, let's just say that we ought to at least recognize the thought that went behind it. You know, when people stand Shemoneh Esrei, when you daven, when you pray in the synagogue, you are supposed to stand like a soldier before the Lord. And these people, in their sense, have cast themselves through the centuries as the real soldiers of the Jewish people. So it is a different sense when we go back to this. This is the sense of soldiering the Jews always cultivated in themselves, right? That we are the soldiers of God. So in this one generation, and more than one generation, but in this generational transformation, I have great confidence that this transformation will slowly take place. There are now Haredi units in the armed forces, and I predict, not in my lifetime, but certainly by my grandchildren's lifetime, the majority of officers are going to be from Haredi communities.
Sir.
Yes, I'm wondering if you've been able to see the museum in New York, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which is sort of a Holocaust museum, and what your reaction is. I can tell you my own observation is even though there is mention of Zionism and certainly of Israel, you have to look for it. It's really like a footnote or a sideshow. I think they give more space and more newsreel footage to the post-Holocaust Jews of Australia than they do to Ben-Gurion and the foundation of the State of Israel. And every time I've been there, I'm always disappointed when I get to the third floor because I believe I'm going to see, well, this is how Israel came out of the Holocaust. And if it's 10% of what's up there, it's probably a lot. And I'm wondering whether you've looked at it and how you feel about it.
Well, I don't know it as well as you do. I've been there once on a tour, and then just one other time in the building. Well, I think that one of the things that it tried to do was to really cast itself as a museum of American interest, of American Jewry. And as such, it may have thought that it cannot give special place. But I take your point. I mean, I think that there are room for all kinds of museums to many different aspects of the Jewish people. After all, it's a long history, and there are many facets to Jewish history and many facets to museum work. But your point, the main point that you're making is that our way of showing the story of Israel in this country as a whole is really underdeveloped. And you see how late Israel studies has come to the universities. Now one is beginning to have chairs of Israel studies. Now, so many years later, when Middle East studies, anti-Israel studies in many cases, is so firmly entrenched. And you have a further problem, that many of the people whom you want to come to bring to teach Israel studies, you know, would be teaching anti-Israel studies, in fact. So the problems are real, but I think that you should press that issue. In other words, you're a citizen, it's your museum, and I think that if the supply and demand is what museums are about, if there was a real constituency that said, look, one of the things we would like to see is the story of Israel told here so our children could come here and see how it developed, right? See many phases of its development, and we need a physical space to show that, there would be receptivity.
But I wanted to ask you, speaking about the museum, what do you think of Yad Vashem in this context?
So it's like night and day, you see, because Yad Vashem is exactly the Passover story. You go through Yad Vashem physically, in a very physical way, and you come out in Jerusalem. Case made. It is the most exalting moment that one could have of Jerusalem. No?
Yes.
There's a lady in the back.
Hi, thank you for your speech. It was really enlightening. You gave a really specific definition of anti-Semitism, of the organization of politics, and it kind of leads into what he was talking about with the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I feel that some scholars talk about the separation of anti-Semitism from Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-Israel, and I was wondering how you would draw that distinction, particularly if you're talking about politics.
Right. Well, thank you for making it more explicit. I would like to make it as explicit as possible. If you define anti-Semitism as the organization of politics against the Jews, my point is that anti-Zionism is a stronger case of anti-Semitism. It's not just anti-Semitism, it's a newer form of anti-Semitism because it organizes politics against the Jews of the Jewish state rather than the Jews of dispersion. But it is the organization of politics against the Jews. And I would say, my way of looking at it is look at its functions. Look at its functions. If you look at its functions in the Arab world, it's devastating. Because, for example, it's one of the few things that brings together pan-Arabism. You see how much internal conflict there is in the Arab world. One of the few things that unites them is the organization of politics against Israel. So just as an organizing, domestically, there are so many domestic problems. How many of those rulers use this same technique of grievance and blame to get people to focus out there as Israel is the cause? Another reason, another function. If you start adding up the functions, I'll tell you, the Arab world is divided, among other ways, between religious now and national groups. One of the things that in the Palestinian movement, for example, that unites factions of nationalists on the one hand and religious on the other hand, Hamas and the PLO and so on, is the war against Israel. So the horrible part about it is that if you see how many functions this plays in the Arab world, if you don't begin to chip away at them, they just grow more powerful every year so that these people think they cannot ever give it up. No wonder they say, we will never recognize the Jewishness of, what would they have? So it is really our job to point this out, to point out that this is the function of the organization of politics against the Jewish state, and to point out why it is so destructive of them. That is the point, right? Not that it is so destructive of us, which it may or may not be, but it is so destructive of them because it is not the right analysis, and because it really prevents them from doing all the work that they would have to do in order to show, to say, the fault is within us. We have to improve. We have to change. We have to find ways of becoming like Israel, right?
There's a gentleman in front here, Mary.
First of all, thank you, Professor Wisse. As a side note, I read your book, No Joke, and your thirsty hiker joke is one of the great jokes I've used publicly.
Oh,
People love it. So,
it used to be new.
it's still a great joke.
Okay.
Yoram Hazony made the point in the clearest way that I've come across, where he points at the fact that Israel, to some extent, is on the wrong side of history vis-a-vis Europe, because because the Europeans came out of World War II and took the lesson, focusing on the aggressor, that nation states were bad. Jews looked from the perspective of the victim and said nation states are our only protection. And you have this universalizing tendency in Europe that we're kind of an anachronism in the face of. The other thing that I'd like your kind of thoughts on is it seems that as modernity kind of travels on very quickly, that the whole idea of a nation state is eroding, and that people's own concept of themselves as part of a nation is no longer adequate in some very deep ways, which kind of raises, why we've existed for so long, partly through our spiritual relationship with God. And nations that don't have that, I think, are in deep trouble. And I think that both of those in the civilized world, in the European world, are increasing sources of potential anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering what you would think.
Well, it's a very thick, and very intense question and multifaceted. I don't know whether I can get to all the points that you raise. But as the first one, I see around me a world of nation states. I don't know what Yoram Hazony sees, and I understand his point, but and it's very beautifully point. And by the way, I'm a great fan of his, genuinely. But I really don't see that as being the problem so much. I think that goes deeper than that, one of the problems the Jews face, and this may be what you're getting at in the second part of your question, is that we are constituted differently from other nations and differently from other religions. And so we are a religious civilization. We are a tribal religion. We are bound genetically. We are bound familially. We form a different model. We do not sufficiently appreciate how to explain that model and how to live with it. And we certainly do not sufficiently appreciate that every universalizing trend, unfortunately, is going to become our enemy. So Christianity was a universalizing idea. We are not just the Jews for ourselves and so on. We have a religion which is all-encompassing. Islam is all-encompassing. Communism is all-encompassing. Multiculturalism in our midst is all-encompassing. The more you get, and I worry about things like environmentalism. As soon as you begin to get a really universalizing ideology, it chokes on the Jews because it sees the Jews as, what is this? It's some rearguard action. It's some kind of resistance to our idea of universalizing. Now, it fits into also the idea of what is liberalism. And this is an interesting point to remember. One of my very favorite all-time greatest writers is George Eliot. And a book that I could not live without is her book, Daniel Deronda. And why is that? Because in that book, she actually takes up this issue where she has the heroine, she has one of the young girls, a young Jewish girl, Mira, who is suicidal. She comes from a terrible family, and she doesn't know what's going to happen. And this Jewish girl is about to drown herself. She is saved, and she is given refuge in the house of the Meyrick family, which is a wonderful, loving, embracing family. The 3 daughters of the household care for her and adore her. The young man of the household wants to marry her. They love her. And they say to her, you can become one of us and you don't have to be a Jew. She cries and she says, that is the first cruel thing you have ever said to me. This is George Eliot speaking through her. The whole book is that way. And what is George Eliot saying? That a liberalism, British liberalism in her case, a liberalism that can only love you and tolerate you because it wants to embrace you into itself, is no liberalism at all. That there has to be a liberalism that is able to deal with the person who says, I'm so glad that you tolerate and like me because I'm different and I want to be. And she takes the Jews as the test case of this. You see? As the test case of why this distinction. So I think it is very important to face from the point of view of liberalism if one believes in it. That if one really believes in it, you have to appreciate this quality of the Jews, that they will not, at their best, they will not dissolve into everyone else. And one other thing about this, right? That anyone who really wants to can become a Jew, but not everyone has to become a Jew. This is an astonishing balance of a people, right? Not many people can maintain this balance. That on the one hand, if you really want to, you can become a Jew. And may I say, since you were asking, and all of us are nervous about these things, 3 of the strongest defenders I know of the Jewish people, not only strongest, but most effective, happen to be converts to Judaism. So bless those people who do decide to become Jews. They can, but we don't go out there saying that everyone has to become a Jew. Somehow we live with this. Other people should be able to live with it too.
Professor Wisse, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.